In balance power, each side is differentiated. They have many alternatives, and you're powerful together, and you're intolerant of anything that will affect a relationship. When it is balanced, it is most likely that you'll try to find ways to get along. Once again, it doesn't mean the power is equal, it means that it's differentiated. Of course, Ford is supplying the vehicles to dealerships, but dealerships are supplying the money to Ford. And so they're in this finger pointing situation right now, and it's very difficult for one side or the other to get their way out. I don't know. And so in balance power, each side is different and they have many alternatives. And so they're powerful, but they're intolerant of coercive tactics. So this slide basically says one of the difficulties with dealers, especially as they're vulnerable to coercion and threats. And the question you would ask is why? Well, it comes down to this. It comes down to what we did. We talked about on Wednesday of last week. Okay, the reasons for conflict have to do with this: more outlets. The truth is that the manufacturer and the end user are on the same side. They both want more places to be able to sell their goods. The manufacturer, once again, their thing is generating revenue by selling everything that they make. The consumer wants more outlets because it gives them more options and lower price. Whereas the retailer, their desire is for more profit. And so this is why dealers are vulnerable to coercions and threats. And I can't believe they actually would, poke the bear in selling these things and continue to go on, because basically the future's staring at them in the face. So you got 5 ways to act. One of them is just go along with it. The other is pounding the table, going along anyway. And this doesn't do anything but give you a bruised fist. You can neglect the suppliers by relegating them a line lower priority and cutting back on resources. So basically, you could say, I'm selling only your low end stuff. I can threaten to sell your line entirely. Or perhaps the dealers might want to get into a constructive discussion with Ford and use what they call creative voice. Creative voice is an example of, let's get together and see if we can come up with a solution. It's the most difficult, but it's the only one that lasts. And so these can mitigate the effects, but once again, does it bleed away the conflict? Not entirely. The worst thing when it comes to conflict is perceived unfairness. Perceived unfairness exerts the greatest impact on cooperation and flexibility. If I perceive I am being treated unfairly, I usually react with strong negative reactions such as anger, which will increase the severity. It aggravates the effects. It increases the chance of opportunism. I start to have negative motives to my sellers. It doesn't matter what kind of positive thing that they come up with. My first answer is, what are they trying to do? I feel like I'm about to be taken advantage of. My reaction as a channel member is that I'm going to respond severely and I'll seek retribution. And it becomes a negative spiral over and over and over. Now, you're going to find two types of fairness that is expected. And those two types of fairness are up here. One is called procedural fairness. It might even be called procedural justice. You'll find this in industrial organizational psychology quite a bit. Also, when it comes to agency theory and dyad structures between manufacturers and workers, procedural fairness is the thought that I'm being treated fairly in a day-to-day manner. In other words, the daily interactions between me and my channel partners are in what we would call the situational norms, the expected code of behavior. I'm treated fairly. I'm at the place in the line where I should be. I'm not being neglected or abused. And that is procedural fairness or procedural justice. Distributive fairness or distributive justice means that the belief that I'll be rewarded in a fair manner once that everything is finished. In other words, I will receive fair compensation, an honest day's work, a wage for an honest day's work. Distributive fairness. The goods are distributed in a fair way. Easy way to think of it. Okay. Unfairness is relationship poison or relationship acid. You can look at it either way. But it destroys friendships, connections, relationships. It makes everything worse. And so you can have conflict, but when you pour unfairness on top of the conflict, you put together gasoline in the match. And so, how do we resolve differences? There has to be ways of doing this. How do we forestall conflict or even make conflict some way of resolving differences? These will be the last parts of this chapter. The first thing that you do is you recognize that conflict exists and you institutionalize it. You create policies to address conflict in its earliest stages or even before it comes up. In the handbook somewhere inside that we work with in Appalachian State, there will be some place there in annual reviews where the person being reviewed has the option to appeal. The option to appeal is the institutionalization of recognizing that conflict exists and there needs to be resolution strategies. Institutionalized policies, spit it up, are part of the environment in which we work in. It is the set functions in there. It's the expectation that we're not going to get along, but we're going to find a way to resolve it. So there's many ways of doing it. You can do things like have trade association partnerships. You can have distributor councils. The mafia and the five families, you can't go kill someone unless you find out from us that it's okay. What a wonderful way to get along. But the exchange of personnel also is another great program. So in Bentonville, Arkansas, in the headquarters of Walmart, there's actually an office of Procter & Gamble there. They have over 100 P&G workers from Procter & Gamble that have their own office inside of Walmart. By the very same token, inside, I think P&G's headquarters is in Dayton, Ohio. Inside of P&G, there's a Walmart office in there as well. The exchange of personnel is a great idea, all right? It is a way to understand your partners by living with them and understand that, all right? And so if I can get on a one-on-one relationship with my partners, then I have a better way of understanding their pathway and finding some way of resolving our own differences. But it doesn't last. And then sometimes what happens is you get into what's known as irreconcilable differences, all right? That there are differences that can't be reconciled between you and your partner. At this point, there's what's known as a built-in appeal process known as a third party. Third party boards are places where you can go to try to find some kind of resolution. And so what are third parties? Third parties are exactly that. You have two parties that come to irreconcilable differences, and someone in the middle helps you resolve the situation. Now, there's two types. The first one, sorry, did I go? Okay, I went one step ahead, excuse me. So I wanted to first state, before I go on to third parties, I also wanted to state that one way to resolve conflict is through the intensive exchange of information. If I divulge sensitive information, I leave myself vulnerable. But vulnerability leaves you open to reciprocity. We only trust people that we're willing to share our most sensitive secrets. And at some point, real friendships happen when we're willing to open up. If I'm willing to share something with you that is sensitive to me, I might bruise myself, but I leave it open for you to share something back. An example of this is joint membership in trade associations. So the way IBM dominated the 80s in the IBM PC world was to do something that was incredibly smart. Philip Don Estridge, who was the head of Entry Systems Division in IBM, when Apple was the dominant and IBM wanted to come in, did something that was incredible. Philip Don Estridge published the standards of being able to hook up to an IBM PC so that anyone with money could build a piece of equipment that hooked to an IBM PC flawlessly. And so it meant that instead of IBM making all the money, Seagate made hard drives, Hayes made modems, Shugart made floppy disk drives. Who was it? BSI made monitors. They basically introduced a wealth of followers along with them because they shared really secret stuff. And we had the birth of open systems from one of the most deeply secret organizations in the world at the time. It was unprecedented. And that's why in 3 years, where the Apple II sold 800,000 units, in 3 years, IBM sold 40 million PCs and the world never looked back. if you're willing to share it, you might get dinged, but then again, sometimes it's the only pathway to the future. And I'm a firm believer in open systems, okay? So, information intensive mechanisms. The second is third-party mechanisms. Now we're in the land of Jean-Luc Picard and Star Trek: The Next Generation. So Picard would come to a planet. You had two sides that were irresolvable, that were at war with each other constantly for generations. And Jean-Luc Picard would try to sit them down and find some ways to obtain peace. And after the pace of an hour, he found a way and they flew off. The way he would try to do it is he would do what's called third-party mediation. So he's the individual in the middle, you have the two sides off to the side. The purpose of the mediator is to find common ground. You try to get the parties to continue the negotiations by considering the other partners or to make substantial recommendations. The key behind good mediators is to find ways to get them to get along. So there was an interesting one in the second season in which they had an individual who was hearing impaired and mute. He could not speak and he could not hear, but he had individuals that cognitively connected to him who spoke for him. These people were killed. And what he did was the two sides were so desperate that the way that it ended was both sides trying to learn how to communicate. And that's how it ended. And that was an example of good mediation. The mediator has no power whatsoever. They can't settle disputes. And so mediators hopefully can find the common ground and then they step away.
Another question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about mediation, are you like referring to like litigation, like a mediator in like litigation?
That, well, it depends on if the litigator has the ability to invoke, a decision. All right. So a mediator, if they're,
Settlement?
yeah, I mean, they can't produce a settlement. The settlement has to be between the two parties, but they act as a broker between the two. Now, if that person has the ability to actually make the decision, that it's agreed on by both sides that that person can do it, then we have an arbitrator. Okay. And that's what arbitration is. Arbitration is a third party makes the decision because the other two sides have come simply to impossible to come up with an agreement. And they've decided that the third party has the power to make the choice. So there's two types of arbitration. One is compulsory arbitration, in which the two parties have no choice. Usually these are parties that have to do with the national interest. All right. Air traffic controllers, railroads, transportation of any kind, key important metals, important factors of production. These are generally ones that are considered compulsory in arbitration. Then their decision is final and it's binding, and it is a take or leave it strategy. There is no take it or leave it strategy. You just take it. Okay. So that's compulsory arbitration. Voluntary arbitration is when two sides are so desperate that they give that to a third party and they agree beforehand, which is important to understand, is you agree with this beforehand that the decision is final and binding. So a little baseball history here. I certainly would not be as insensitive to think of this in the classic example of indentured servitude. But during the 60s, baseball could only go to one team to be able to play baseball. It's not indentured servitude in the way that we think about those poor, people who are having to do things because they have no choice. These are baseball players, but then again, their careers were held hostage by the baseball owners until 1968. A baseball player, Kurt Flood, who played for the St. Louis Cardinals, an all-star, challenged the right of baseball owners to do that and sued for free agency. He lost his career because of it, but in 5 years, in 1973, he won. And he started free agency in the United States for the first time. Salaries rose rapidly, but what happened also in that time is that baseball owners entered into what's called collusion. So what collusion means is it's an unspoken agreement about how you're going to do things. And so if a baseball player wanted to move to be able to get a better salary, the baseball owners, tongue in cheekly, without wink, wink, basically saying, no, I won't take your best players from you. That's a concept, by the way, known as dispirited impact. Just by the very nature of the way that you are performing, you are discriminatory, all right? It is, the laws are not discriminatory, but the practice is. And dispirited impact, especially in low-income families and low-income areas, is what the Community Reinvestment Act of 1992 is all about. Anyway, 92, 94, we had the next baseball strike come up. I think it was 50 games or 60 games were canceled. The baseball owners were holding out. They were losing billions of dollars. The baseball players were in just as bad straits. Finally, with the baseball players in desperation, Martin Miller, the lawyer of baseball, said, I just want one thing. If our players can't come to agreement with the owners, I ask for the right of third-party arbitration with a federal judge. The baseball owners said yes, signed it off, and baseball came back. Now, who do you think won? The baseball owners or the baseball players? Owners. For about 6 months. Okay? Because guess what happened? The federal judges looked at the salaries of athletes around the world, and players who were making $200,000 a year were going to $6.5 million a year overnight. And from 1994 to 2014, baseball players were basically saying, I'll see you in court. You know, we don't even have to negotiate salaries anymore. I'll just go to the judges. And what happened, the owners had to be pushed, and the owners started to have to negotiate in an equitable manner. But it also meant the baseball, which has no salary cap, meant that the Yankees could buy a few championships because they spent 9 times what the Kansas City Royals did on players. But the Royals during the same period won 2 World Series too, so they didn't do too bad. Anyway, it's about strategy. So anyway, this is an example of arbitration, and it worked, all right? It created a better standard, and now baseball owners are saying, we'll see you in court now because everything is measured out. So anyway, just a little. The last or the third is to build relational norms, expected codes of behavior. The way you're supposed to do things in your groups. You create mechanisms that are proactively designed and consciously put in to maintain that level of respect. You try to move it to some constructive behavior. So the first one is flexibility. You hope that each side of the organization can adapt to changing circumstances. You find some way of getting along. Information exchange. When asked or requested, you give information quickly and completely. And then finally, solidarity, which is the same thing as the efficient and the better use of power. is that everyone works for the common good. Now, you can't decide one day you're going to wake up and say, I'm going to build relational norms. It doesn't happen that way. But what you want to do is start at one point and you encourage daily interactions and people in the marketing channel and you promote for the common good. What it does in the long run is it takes a while, like everything does, but you'll find that there'll be a willingness and an openness that it took a long time to get to, but you'll get there. And so the building of relational norms, which is the same as procedural fairness, you're being treated daily, you're treated fairly in a day-to-day manner. So I'm not going to worry about ongoing conflict resolution styles, other than to say that problem solving is the best of all of them. It seeks to get it all. Try to make sure that everyone wins. Compromise, unfortunately, means that everybody gets half of what they want, which means nobody is completely happy. I've told you my own conflict resolution style, it's winner take all. And Dr. Ollinson wins. I want to happy about it. The last is you want to use incentives. Appealing to an individual's economic self-interest is a highly effective way of settling a dispute. Look, do you realize we can capture 40% of the market if we move? Come on, let's do this thing, you and I. We can get it done. Let's knock it out in a week. Economic incentives, you have to do more than a better price. It has to be an overall set of elements. There's an old saying by Robert Heinlein, never appeal to a person's better nature because they may not have it, appeal to their greed. Yeah, mostly. The problem, of course, is just like reward power. If I tell my daughter, if you finish before 7, you get a cookie. The problem is that the economic incentives rapidly multiply. And it's very difficult to know who to reward whom when you have so many contact points. It makes keeping track very difficult. And so information exchange, third-party arbitration or third parties, using incentives, and relational norms. Those are 4 ways that we can try to resolve conflict. Do they work? Yes, they do, but like everything that's good, it takes time. And that finishes with chapter 11, and we're going to start very briefly on chapter 12 and start talking about a relationship. These last ones get very Dr. Philip. So, the first is, why do we need relationships? Well, we need relationships, quite honestly, because the world is constantly changing. And there is no fixed ground. If you remember from chapter 9, we're shifting to a service economy. And loyalty becomes more important than ever. With the increase of competition and the commoditization of a product, consumers are looking more and more on the one thing, and that's price. And yet, price is not a factor that always wins. Steel tools are 50 to 100% more expensive, and yet Steel Tools has a loyalty that all the others just look at with envy. Because the value that a steel tool brings is far more than just a piece of equipment that they use. And realize this, the $1 spent in personal selling is more valuable than $1 spent in advertising. So is anybody in here in selling as a concentration? Okay, good for you. Got a job? Not yet. What year are you? Okay, you got one more year. Because I can tell you this, in the 10 years that since Dr. Gosh started this, there hasn't been a single individual like yourself that hasn't left without a job. Okay. Personal selling has grown dramatically because as we commoditize things, the human element becomes more important than ever. All right. Not only that, they don't want you to go to graduate school. They want you to come out as an undergraduate, so save your money. All right. And they'll spend 2 years training you, spending $150,000, which is the average for salespeople. Why? Because of this. It's your impact on sales. You have the ability to immediately handle any problems, one right out. You're the boundary span. You're the difference between the corporations and the individuals. All right. So that's why you're important. Okay. And this same thing pertains when we're talking about relationships. Relationships provide connections that bind the organizations. They're enduring, they're substantial, but they take time. They go by many names: relational governance, hybrid governance. They all mean the same thing. So you don't have to worry about that. But basically, it just means the desire and the need to connect and stay together. The ironic thing is that with a personal salesperson, you get a better coverage with a lower cost. Not only that, but if they have a strong relationship with you, they actually represent you. They become what's called marketing mavens. All right. Your best salespeople can be the customers you sell to. And so that's why you want strong relationships. Word of mouth, it still exists, and it's what social media is built on. There are two primary things that build relationships. One is commitment, and the other is trust. And if I am to go back to this is one of the 2 point bonus questions that I'll give you on a separate test thing. Who wrote the commitment trust theory of relationship marketing? Is Morgan and Hunt, 1994. Robert Morgan and Shelby Hunt. And as remember, I talked about last week that commitment and trust are irrevocably linked to long-term relationships.
Trust and what you say.
Trust and commitment. Okay. Commitment trust theory. These are the two individuals that spawned an entire genre of marketing. This is one of the articles in marketing that we say created a paradigm shift in the way that we think, until 10 years later, we had another paradigm shift. And that was when we came up with the marketing co-creation theory, in which the consumers co-create their own value. And that if we can encourage the consumer to co-create their value, then it becomes even greater. Okay. And that was Bargo and Lush, but you don't have to worry about that. Okay. So an effective channel relationship exhibits genuine commitment. The concept of commitment is when one group desires a relationship to continue indefinitely. Very difficult to define. It's like an attitude, it's the expectation, it's knowing that you have that out there. I'm a firm believer, folks, if you're gonna do anything, you might as well commit all the way until something stops you. Now, it's also important, boy, it's gonna get real, Dr. Philly. Relationships encumber the parties. They impose obligations on you. You're not going stepping out. You have a commitment. But the commitment has benefits. It has costs. But what doesn't? All right. But there's strength in it. But it doesn't mean simply that commitment by itself is going to make it work. But it's one of the important steps. This is why it is also the old saying, it takes two to tango, why asymmetric commitments are uncommon and don't exist, actually. In other words, one side simply can't commit while another side stays loose. Commitment is a long-term horizon effect. It's an active desire to keep your relationship open. It's a willingness to sacrifice to maintain the relationship. And let me also say that in the long-term horizon, it means it actually erects barriers against future competition. You're going to make it work. And so you keep the relationship going, you have a commitment to it. So why would you want to do it? So an upstream member, this is an example. They have a new product that they want to seek out. They want to be able to work with their distributors. They cooperate in an open manner and are willing to tell secrets. We've got to get this product line launched to be successful. This can be the future of our organization. Will you help us? Influence the asking, okay? And many times, reciprocity will step in and they'll say, of course we do. But that's only after you have a strong relationship. These relationship investments, such as generic investments in knowledge, tell them the secrets about your work, and it gives them confidence when they speak to their end users. And as I said before, it helps to erect barriers to get future competitors out of the way. These are the reasons why. For downstream members, you have the peace of mind of having a solid relationship with a successful partner and a constant stream, stable supply of products that are desired. Steel tools as an upstream will pay 30% of any new construction on one of their downstream dealerships if it has even some small part to do with steel tools. Doesn't even have to have 10% of it. The downstream members receive that further commitment, and it makes them different and unique. It's the uniqueness that builds the extra profit, which is what the dealerships need, okay? Steel wants to sell units. The retailers want to make profit. Steel gives them the ability to make more profit. It means that the profit makes them more committed to steel. It is these value-based services that steel offers, steel distributors that is, that can't be copied. that ultimately create this enduring competitive advantage, and that's what a competitive advantage is. It is a unique way of doing things in a superior fashion, bless you, that cannot be easily copied. Competitive advantages can always be copied. It's the old saying, I know a good idea when I steal one, okay? Not STIHL. But this is what a downstream member wants. What is the payoff? Higher loyalty, higher sales, and more cooperation. We will talk about trust on Wednesday. But one of the drivers of commitment is trust. One of the important strategies, if you ever get into leadership by organization, the book that I showed you, is the willingness to trust in your downstream members to do their jobs. You give them the tools to do their job and the trust that they're going to do it right. So in 2004, when Katrina was rolling towards the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, there was a phone call from Walmart to the managers of the stores in Bay St. Louis and Gulfport and in Pass Christian. I know that I grew up in that area, so I know it very well. I read the story about it in the Wall Street Journal, and one of the things that they said was the main regional manager told the managers down there was, in the next few days, you're going to have to do jobs or make decisions that are far beyond your pay grade. All I'm going to do is tell you this: do good, do the right thing, and we'll back you up. That's what they said. So that day, Katrina was rolling in, the trucks were rolling in from Arkansas. The manager of the Bay St. Louis took a heister to be able to get through his door when the door was broken so that the police could get valuable stuff.
He took a what?
He took a heister, a forklift, okay? Yeah, and basically drove it through the door so that they could get in because the police needed things that were desperate there. They turned over the Walmart to the Gulfport police in Gulfport so that they could use that as a base, because guess what? It was one of the few places that had a constant rate of supply of energy. Those are the kinds of things you do. You trust your people. Now, trust is necessary, but it's not sufficient. But it gives confidence in your partners when you trust them. But it takes a long time to make it work. So this is the final slide. This is a meta-analysis, by the way, is what you do in research when you're researching other research. So in meta-analysis, you look up any other research that has to do with trust and relationships and commitment. And they looked at 20 years of research data and realized this is like 15 years ago, when you had to have some poor PhD candidate like myself actually having to look at them without having any way of scanning it. So you downloaded it yourself, you spent time, with your yellow pen markers, and now you can do this in a day, what took us a month, okay? So they took 20 years of research, looked at 38,000 relationships, and what they found is this is what's called a power effect, okay? And so what it says is that relationships strongly affect the word of mouth, what we say. And so 60% of positive word of mouth comes from a strong relationship. 52%, over half of loyalty, has to do with our strong relationships. And then the last one that makes even greater sense is that over a third of your actual performance, how well you're succeeding, comes from how strong a relationship you have with your partners. And so what's the net effect? The net effect is you make more money. That's what you're hoping. Okay, We're done? We will finish up on Wednesday. I will have up your grades. And I hope you all have a good day. Thank you.